The war in Ukraine is a tragedy for the Ukrainian people. Families have been torn apart, homes destroyed, and lives lost. The emotional and psychological toll on the Ukrainian population is immense, with countless individuals facing an uncertain future. It is also a tragedy for Europe and the world. The conflict has sparked a wave of solidarity across the globe, with numerous protests and demonstrations calling for peace and justice. European leaders have been in constant discussions, trying to navigate the complex geopolitical landscape that this war has created. This war began in 2014 with the Russian seizure of Crimea and the Donbas. The annexation of Crimea was a significant turning point, leading to widespread protests and international condemnation. The situation in the Donbas region further escalated tensions, setting the stage for the current conflict. It escalated dramatically in February 2022 with the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by the Russian Federation. The invasion brought widespread destruction and chaos, with cities under siege and civilians caught in the crossfire. Ukrainian resistance forces have shown remarkable resilience, fighting to defend their homeland against overwhelming odds. This war has shattered the peace that had prevailed in Europe since 1945. The continent, which had enjoyed decades of relative stability and prosperity, now faces a new era of uncertainty. The echoes of past conflicts are felt once again, reminding us of the fragile nature of peace. It has caused a humanitarian catastrophe, with millions of Ukrainians displaced from their homes. Refugee camps have sprung up across Europe, and aid workers are tirelessly providing support to those in need. The scale of the displacement is unprecedented, with families forced to leave everything behind in search of safety. And it has raised the specter of a wider conflict between Russia and the West. NATO forces are on high alert, and there is a significant military buildup in Eastern Europe. The potential for escalation is a constant concern, with diplomatic efforts ongoing to prevent a broader war. This essay will provide a comprehensive analysis of the Ukraine-Russia war. It will delve into the various dimensions of the conflict, offering insights from experts and analysts who have been closely monitoring the situation. The goal is to provide a nuanced understanding of the war and its far-reaching implications. It will begin by examining the historical background to the conflict, focusing on the post-Soviet period and the 2014 Euromaidan protests. These protests marked a significant moment in Ukraine's history, as citizens demanded closer ties with Europe and an end to corruption. The aftermath of these events set the stage for the current conflict. It will then discuss the events leading up to the 2022 invasion, as well as the key battles and turning points in the war so far. The analysis will cover the strategic decisions made by both sides, the impact of these battles on the overall conflict, and the evolving military tactics employed. The essay will also analyze the humanitarian crisis caused by the war, including the displacement of millions of Ukrainians and the international aid efforts that have been undertaken in response. The global community has rallied to provide support, but the scale of the crisis presents ongoing challenges. It will also examine the global economic impact of the conflict, focusing on the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia and the disruptions to global energy and food supplies. The economic repercussions are felt worldwide, affecting markets, supply chains, and everyday lives. Finally, the essay will conclude by discussing the current status of the war and the prospects for peace, noting the complexity and ongoing nature of the conflict. Diplomatic efforts continue, but the path to a lasting resolution remains uncertain. This war is a defining moment for our times. It is reshaping the geopolitical landscape and will be remembered as a pivotal event in the 21st century. It is a test of the international order, of the values of democracy and freedom, and of our collective humanity. The response to this conflict will set a precedent for how the world addresses similar crises in the future. The outcome of this war will have profound implications for the future of Europe and the world. The decisions made in the coming months and years will shape the trajectory of international relations and the global balance of power. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 led to a period of great upheaval and uncertainty in Europe. The once mighty Soviet Empire disintegrated almost overnight, leaving a power vacuum and a sense of instability that rippled across the continent. The former Soviet republics, including Ukraine, were suddenly independent states facing the daunting task of building new political, economic and social systems. These newly sovereign nations had to navigate the complex transition from centrally planned economies to market-oriented systems, while also establishing democratic institutions and governance structures. The end of the Cold War also led to a reassessment of the security architecture of Europe. With the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, Western nations sought to redefine their strategic priorities and ensure stability in a rapidly changing geopolitical landscape. NATO, the Western military alliance, expanded eastward, admitting several former Soviet bloc countries as members. This expansion was seen as a way to promote security and democracy in Eastern Europe, but it also stirred fears and resentment in Russia. This expansion was seen by Russia as a threat to its security interests, and it contributed to the growing tensions between Russia and the West. The Kremlin viewed NATO's encroachment as a direct challenge to its sphere of influence and a potential encirclement of its borders. In Ukraine, the post-Soviet period was marked by political instability and economic challenges. The country struggled with corruption, weak institutions, and a lack of cohesive national identity, which made governance difficult and often contentious. The country was divided between a Russian-speaking population in the east and a Ukrainian-speaking population in the west. This linguistic and cultural divide often translated into political divisions, with the east generally favoring closer ties with Russia and the west leaning towards European integration. This division was exploited by Russia, which sought to maintain its influence in Ukraine and prevent it from aligning too closely with the West. Through a combination of propaganda, political pressure, and economic leverage, Russia aimed to keep Ukraine within its orbit. The Orange Revolution of 2004 and the Euromaidan protests of 2014 were both popular uprisings against corrupt governments that were seen as being too close to Russia. These movements were driven by a desire for transparency, accountability, and a break from the oligarchic systems that had taken root in the post-Soviet era. These protests were met with brutal repression by the Ukrainian authorities, and they ultimately led to the ouster of the pro-Russian presidents Viktor Yanukovych in 2004 and Viktor Yanukovych again in 2014. The violent crackdowns only fueled the resolve of the protesters and highlighted the deep-seated issues within the Ukrainian political system. The Euromaidan protests in particular were a turning point in Ukrainian history. They represented a clear rejection of Russian influence and a strong push towards European integration and democratic reforms. They demonstrated the Ukrainian people's desire for democracy, freedom, and closer ties with Europe. The sight of Ukrainian and European Union flags flying side by side became a powerful symbol of the country's aspirations and its determination to chart its own course. They also marked the beginning of Russia's more aggressive posture towards Ukraine. In response to Ukraine's pivot towards the West, Russia annexed Crimea in 2014 and supported separatist movements in eastern Ukraine, leading to a protracted and bloody conflict that continues to this day. The Maidan Uprising, also known as the Revolution of Dignity, was a pivotal moment in Ukraine's post-Soviet history. Beginning in November 2013, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians took to the streets of Kyiv and other cities to protest against the government of then-President Viktor Yanukovych. Yanukovych's decision to abandon an association agreement with the European Union in favor of closer ties with Russia sparked the protests. The protesters, many of whom were young people, saw the move as a betrayal of Ukraine's European aspirations and a sign that Yanukovych was more interested in serving the interests of Moscow than those of his own people. The protests, which centered on Kyiv's Maidan Nezalezhnosti, or Independence Square, quickly evolved into a broader movement demanding an end to corruption, government accountability, and respect for human rights. The Ukrainian government responded with violence, using riot police, snipers, and other means to disperse the protesters. Despite the violence and intimidation, the protests continued to grow in size and intensity. The protesters' determination, coupled with mounting international pressure, forced Yanukovych to flee to Russia in February 2014. The Maidan uprising had a profound impact on Ukraine. It demonstrated the power of civil society, the Ukrainian people's commitment to democratic values, and their aspiration to break free from Russia's orbit. However, the uprising also came at a heavy price, with over 100 protesters killed and many more injured. In the early hours of February 24, 2022, the world watched in shock and disbelief as Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The scenes of tanks rolling across the border and missiles lighting up the sky were reminiscent of a bygone era, yet they were happening in real time, in the heart of Europe. The invasion, which came after months of military build-up and bellicose rhetoric from Moscow, marked a dramatic escalation of the conflict that had begun in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea and the Donbas War. The world had been on edge watching the build-up of Russian forces along the Ukrainian border, but few had anticipated the scale and ferocity of the assault that was to come. Russian President Vladimir Putin, in a televised address, attempted to justify the invasion as a special military operation aimed at demilitarizing and denazifying Ukraine. He claimed that the operation was necessary to protect Russian-speaking populations in Ukraine and to prevent NATO's expansion, framing it as a defensive measure. Putin's claims, widely dismissed as preposterous by the international community, were seen as a pretext for an unprovoked war of aggression against a sovereign nation. Leaders around the world condemned the invasion, calling it a blatant violation of international law and an assault on the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity. The invasion began with a series of missile strikes on Ukrainian military installations, airports, and other strategic targets across the country. The initial bombardment aimed to cripple Ukraine's defense capabilities and create chaos and confusion among its military ranks. Russian ground forces then crossed into Ukraine from multiple directions, from the north towards the capital Kyiv. Their objective was to quickly capture the city and install a pro-Russian government. The advance was met with fierce resistance from Ukrainian forces who were determined to defend their homeland. From the east into the Donbas region, this area had already been a flashpoint of conflict since 2014, and the renewed offensive aimed to consolidate Russian control over the separatist-held territories. And from the south, from Crimea, which Russia had annexed in 2014. The southern front was crucial for Russia to secure a land corridor to Crimea and to cut off Ukraine's access to the Black Sea. The international community swiftly condemned the invasion, with many countries imposing unprecedented sanctions on Russia. These sanctions targeted key sectors of the Russian economy, including banking, energy, and technology, aiming to isolate Russia economically and diplomatically. The United Nations General Assembly, in a rare emergency session, voted overwhelmingly to demand that Russia immediately cease its military operations and withdraw its forces from Ukraine. The resolution, though non-binding, sent a strong message of global solidarity with Ukraine and condemnation of Russia's actions. The invasion of Ukraine sent shockwaves across the globe, raising fears of a wider conflict in Europe and highlighting the fragility of the post-Cold War security order. Protests erupted in cities around the world, with people taking to the streets to show their support for Ukraine and to call for an end to the violence. It also triggered a humanitarian crisis, with millions of Ukrainians displaced from their homes and seeking refuge in neighboring countries. The sudden influx of refugees created immense pressure on the resources and infrastructure of these countries, leading to a coordinated international effort to provide humanitarian aid and support to those affected by the conflict.